Hey everyone, it's Pastor Chad with the third rendition of the Bible Breakdown. It's my hope that this video will help you to remember what I preached last Sunday, but also help you to see in the Bible the truths that hopefully I communicated when I was preaching from Romans 1:16 through 32. The first thing that you need to see when talking about this passage is what was the big idea of my sermon Sunday, and Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And I think that this line especially stands out in our current culture because so many people, even people who call themselves Christians, are ashamed of the gospel. And if they're not ashamed of the gospel as a whole, then they are ashamed of parts of the gospel. And that is what made really what follows so staggering to me. You know, I could have preached just these verses right here, Romans 1:16 through 17, are really important verses, and they contain a lot of important truths in them. In fact, a lot of people say that these two verses are really a summary of everything in the book of Romans, and that these two verses are really what Paul explains. The truths in these two verses are what Paul explains in the rest of the book. But what really stood out to me this Sunday is that Paul, says this big thing, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, that's really in some ways countercultural to the American Christian church. And then in the verses that follow, he begins his rendition of the gospel story. And there's so many things in it that we find really difficult about, what Jesus did for us on the cross. And I'm just going to underline some of those. I'm not going to dive deeply into them, but I want you to see, kind of these difficult things that come up here as Paul begins to share what the gospel is. He talks about the wrath of God. He talks about the godlessness and wickedness of people. He talks about how creation, which is something that, some people don't like in and of itself, should make God's invisible qualities clear to people. He talks about how people are without excuse. And then he goes on to talk about how people didn't glorify God and their thinking became, notice this, futile, and their hearts were foolish. I mean, all things that you would struggle, to communicate to somebody outside of Christianity. He talks about how people in this line here started to worship idols. He really continues about how God gave people over to their sinful desires. Just sinful desires in and of itself is a difficult phrase for people in a world where people believe in, their truths and that morality is relative and not universal. And then he goes on to talk about down here, really, it's one of the strongest statements about the sinfulness of homosexuality in Scripture, one of the strongest and most clear statements about the sinfulness of homosexuality, which is just difficult for us to say and talk about in our current culture. He talks about how God, again, and this is such a difficult thing, that God gives people over, and then he, uses this phrase, depraved mind, and he goes on to talk about these other sins. Here's wickedness again, evil, but then greed, something that our world doesn't seem to be bothered by at all, and depravity, and I think we all agree on murder, so there's one there, but envy, that's not necessarily seen as a bad thing in our world, and lying isn't always seen, that malice. I mean, we go down this gossip, and he talks about slander, and then he refers to people as God haters and insolent, arrogant, boastful. He says all of these things that, some people would call sin, and some, they would say is wrong, and some, wouldn't even say that these things are wrong. But these characteristics for non-Christians, it doesn't feel loving and kind. And really, it's very difficult for us in a culture that really doesn't like the idea of sin at all. And he even says, no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. And that people should know that they are deserving of death. It's a really strong statement about sin and about really it's showing how God views sin and views certain actions of people as wrong. They are disobedient to God and they are wrong. And all of that is so hard for us as modern day Christians living in a country that doesn't believe in absolute truth and doesn't believe in universal morality. And so, when you connect that to this big idea up here, right, that Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, let's keep that line going. It's like, well, how, Paul? That's what stood out to me as I read these verses together. And I think it's so important. And here's why Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. It's because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. What I said Sunday is that Paul isn't ashamed of really any of the gospel because he knows that all of the gospel contains the power to save. And I think he begins, with all of this stuff, going all the way down and over to our next page, all of this stuff, he begins with that because he realizes that people need to know their sinfulness in order to understand their need for a savior. But as he talks about it, we get stuck and we pull these things, in these verses out of context, and we just look at them and say, wow, like Paul kind of sounds like a jerk, and, the wrath of God is hard to deal with. And we look at these things kind of on an island. But for Paul, these things in this paragraph and the paragraphs that follow are not the destination themselves. They're moving us towards the destination, and the destination is the salvation of everyone who believes. Paul is talking about all of these things unashamedly because he knows that ultimately they're pointing back to what he's already said, and that is that the gospel, the story of Jesus, what he did on the cross, his resurrection, even his sinless life, and other things about him, his character and nature, they all are aiming towards the salvation of people. And that salvation, is available to, I think this is so important, and this is another part of the reason that Paul is unashamed of the gospel. It's for everybody. Here his focus is Jew and Gentile, but it's for black and white, rich and poor, smart and not smart. It's for everybody. And so that is something that I think excites Paul about the gospel. And as I talked about in in my sermon, for Paul, the gospel isn't just for salvation for everybody, but it's salvation for Paul. And he calls himself the worst of all sinners. I mean, if you read my handwriting, he says that he doesn't deserve to be an apostle. And so he has seen the power of recognizing all of the sinfulness, and that he deserved the wrath of God to come back to that. He's seen how recognizing all of that ultimately led him to salvation for eternity, but also salvation now and all the benefits that come from it, being forgiven and entering into a real and right relationship with God and having peace and joy and hope and everything that Paul has experienced in his life. And so I said this at the beginning of this sermon series, but it's really important to remember who Paul is. And when he talks about things like salvation, it isn't just some generic idea, but something he's experienced in his own life. And so for Paul, he's not ashamed of the gospel because Paul's seen and understands and knows that the story of what Jesus did for humanity, even the fact that Jesus needed to do it for humanity because of all this sinfulness, is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be excited about and joyful over, because it ultimately offers all people salvation. And that salvation comes because salvation is kind of the result, right? But it comes because of, this idea here, the righteousness of God. I said this in my sermon, and we're going to talk more about it in the next series of sermons, which is all about righteousness. But biblically, it's there's two big ideas contained in the righteousness that God offers, and one is legal and one is relational. not going to be able to fit relational, all this on the screen, but if I can just draw a line. Legally, we are made innocent, and relationally, we are made right with God. That when we become righteous through what Jesus did. And all of that can be had. You don't have to work for it. You don't have to. What I love is that, all of this stuff here, all of this stuff here, all of this stuff here, if I could kind of circle it, we don't have to fix it. We don't have to get over it. We simply have to place our faith in Jesus right here. We have to place our faith in Jesus, and we are then made righteous. And once we are made righteous, it means that we are saved. That's why Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. And so for those of us that have placed our faith in Jesus and become righteous through what he has done, the gospel should not be something we're ashamed of, because we know that in our own lives it is the power of God to save us, and it has saved us. That's why, when Paul begins the gospel, he talks about people's sin, he talks about the wrath of God, he says all these things. Even in the midst of all that, he's not ashamed of the gospel. And so I said it differently in my sermon, but I'm going to try to say it again here in a better way. But we don't have to be ashamed of any of the gospel. I'm going to use shorthand, because all of the gospel, that was an extra letter. Gospel, all of the gospel saves. We don't have to be ashamed of any of the gospel, because all of the gospel saves. And so as you put, it's kind of two passages, but as we put these two passages together, I hope that you would see that Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, not because there's not difficult parts in it, or because he loves telling people about the wrath of God, or that they have no excuse, or that they're deserving of death, but ultimately because he has seen in his own life, and he knows to be true through the Spirit of God, that all of the gospel points to salvation. I hope that's helpful, everyone. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments wherever you're watching this.